All right, this house in Monroe, Washington is listed at $845,000, and we're going to be talking about what it would look like to buy this house. I'll show you two different real quotes using different down payment amounts. One where we'll use a 10% down payment amount, and maybe assume you're kind of a first-time home buyer, don't have a ton of cash, and then we'll look at one quote for a 50% down scenario, and in that scenario we'll assume that you have some cash to bring to the table. You are maybe selling a house that you have some equity in, and you've got some cash to put in the deal, a larger down payment. So we'll look at real numbers for those. We'll look at what your monthly payment might be. We'll look at how much cash you'll have to bring to the deal for each scenario, and then we'll talk about how much income it would take to qualify for each loan amount. My name is Landon Buto, and I work with Cleveland Street Mortgage based in Bothell, Washington. We do loans in Washington and Idaho, and so these are going to be real quotes that we're pulling. They aren't going to be exact numbers, exact rates, because we'll need your situation, and it's going to vary depending on the day, but they're going to give you a good ballpark of what you're looking at. And if they are different, I'll give you a sense of which direction you might be looking, up or down, why it might be different, and just a little bit more than you might be able to get on an online calculator. So let's jump in and look at the actual numbers on this house. All right, so here are the quotes. You can see there's two quotes, one on the right, one on the left. Here on the right, this is the 10% down scenario. On the left, this is the 50% down scenario. And then I'm assuming you have a credit score of 740 to provide this estimate. There are a few other assumptions that I'm making that can have an impact on your pricing. I'm not going to get into the weeds of all of those right now, but just know things like how much money you make. That can have, there are certain programs sometimes that you can fit into if you make less than a certain amount. If your household income is less than a certain amount, or the income that you're using for the loan is less than a certain amount. To make home ownership more attainable, things like that. There are other assumptions that I'm making that have an impact. One key other assumption is that in this scenario, I'm assuming you're a first-time home buyer, and in this one, I am assuming you are not, because I'm assuming you have some equity to bring from the sale of the house. In this scenario, that's probably where you got some of that cash. And then this one, it's lower down payment, so maybe your first-time home buyer coming in. So right away, let's look at these scenarios. Let's look at the 10% down scenario. Right away, you can see it is a $5,954 monthly payment. So very high monthly payment, and that's just what you're going to have to expect at this price point of $845 with only 10% down. So it's a very large loan amount of $760. And so you're just gonna that shouldn't be too much of a surprise. We'll talk about this later, but you're probably gonna have to be making pretty decent income, very good income, in order to qualify for this loan, and obviously in order to take it on. However, it is possible in this area where we have house prices at this point where you might just get into this kind of place for your first home. And be willing to take that on, or whatever makes sense for you. So it is possible. There are four components that make up this monthly payment. First is homeowners insurance of $150, and that's an estimate. It's a rough estimate, but that's a pretty good ballpark for where you might expect at this price point. It might be a little bit higher than that, maybe $175 a month. Just as a reasonable estimate, but that's going to depend on who your insurance provider is and just what coverage you end up getting, because homeowners insurance can vary, but this is a pretty good average number as an estimate. Taxes, this number is the actual number drawn from the county website for this house specifically, $574 a month, so that's exactly what it's going to be. That's what you can expect. I think that is $6,000. A little over $6,000 a year, maybe close to $7,000. And then mortgage insurance is dependent. So mortgage insurance is a fee. It's a cost you have to pay if you put less than 20% down on a house. And the higher your loan amount and your cost of mortgage insurance is impacted by several things, but some of the key things is how big is your loan amount, which obviously here we have a pretty hefty loan amount. How big is your down payment? If you have only a 5% down situation, your mortgage insurance is going to be affected by that because it's a riskier situation. Whereas if you have a 15% down payment, then you'll be in a better situation and your mortgage insurance will be lower. But 171, that's an actual program that we have. And for this, that's a high number, but the reality is for this situation, it could be much higher. This is a program that offers pretty decent mortgage insurance specifically, and so you could be much higher than that for this loan amount for this situation. And then the last component is principal and interest, $5,059, and that is a function of your loan amount here and your interest rate. Interest rate showing 6.999. This was live this morning, 1st of April, and that's just an estimate. That's not the exact rate you're going to end up. This is not an advertisement for that rate. It is just an estimate. However, that's a pretty good sense of where we're at right now, roughly, if you're in this general category. All right, points or credit is another section I want to point out. This section right here. So technically we're showing 586 in points. Points are a fee you can pay upfront to the lender to lock in a lower interest rate. It's a bit of a longer explanation, and I've not found a concise way to explain it, so I'm not going to get into it here. But basically, think of this as nearly 0 points. It's hard to come much closer to 0 points than this. And it's very possible for points to be 20 or 30,000. So this is not like you're paying a bunch in points. Yes, you are paying $600, and that's not nothing, but it's pretty close to zero relative to what it could be. So you're essentially not paying much in points, and we'll talk about the other scenario, credit, when we get to that loan. All right, so next thing I want to look at is closing costs here. We're showing $15,518, which is really high for closing costs for having no other key fees. And a big part of that is just closing costs are correlated with your loan amount and with your purchase price. The higher your loan amount and the higher your purchase price, the higher your closing costs are going to be. However, this could also just be a little bit on the high end. For this situation, for this loan amount, this purchase price, I would probably expect $12,000 rather than $10,000. Usually we say kind of the $10,000 to $12,000 range. But for this scenario, because it's a high loan amount, I would expect closer to 12, or it could be higher, could be closer to this, but somewhere in that range. And closing costs include fees that you have to pay just to get the loan. You have to pay the parties involved who are helping you. You have to pay various fees in order to get the house and get the loan. And those are included in closing costs. The other component of closing costs is what's called prepaids. And basically, those are things you're going to be paying on an ongoing basis. Homeowners insurance, taxes, and then your interest. There are various things that you're actually going to be paying on an ongoing basis, but you have to get set up with them. You have to put them in escrow ahead of time for some of those fees that you're going to be paying on an ongoing basis, because that's just the way that the mortgage process works. I'm not going to get into explaining that right now, but they're not additional costs that are costs of, it's not like you're paying that in order to get the loan. It's just costs that you are agreeing as part of your regular ongoing payment, but you'll have to pay some of those ahead of time, and then those will go into closing costs. So total cash to close is $102,000, and that is your down payment plus a 10% down in this scenario, plus your closing costs. So you're seeing all the cash you're going to have to bring all into the deal of $102,000. So let's look at this other scenario, 50% down, not a first-time home buyer. Pretty quickly you can see the monthly payment dropped a lot to $3,554. And the components of that are homeowners insurance, which will be the same, and that's because that's dependent on the home, not the loan amount or the loan structure. Taxes of $574, again dependent on the home. I grabbed those from the county website. Those are those are exactly what they're going to be. The homeowner's insurance is just an estimate. You could be higher, could be lower. The taxes are the actual number. And then the last section is principal and interest. So you can see with 50% down, you have a loan amount of $422,500. We ended up with an interest rate of 6.999%. And again, this is not an advertisement. It's not exactly what you're going to be at, but it's a pretty good idea of where we are at in terms of rates here at the beginning of April. So that's a pretty good expectation. Points of credit. This time you have a credit of $689. So that's going to be the lender side. Points are a fee you can pay up front to get a lower interest rate. Credit is the opposite of that, where you tell the lender, I'll take a higher interest rate if you give me some cash to cover some of my closing costs. So technically this is a credit of $689, but again, if you missed the last section, basically it's nearly impossible just on a quote to show you $0 in points or credit because lenders just have a rate sheet that shows certain increments of rates, and then they show you what it would cost to get there, and almost never do they have just on that set rate sheet a cost of $0 or a credit of $0. You can get that probably when you go to actually get your loan, but this is pretty close to zero. That number could be $20,000 or $30,000 either direction. So that's a pretty good idea. It's basically this rate for 0 points. And then this number will affect your closing costs down here, just like this number did down here. So it's a difference of over $1,000 just from the credit, and then the rest of the difference comes in from the loan amount. And the fact that you have prepaid mortgage insurance in this situation as well. So total closing costs then of $12,820, and that's probably again, these are vastly different scenarios, vastly different situations. Your closing costs are affected by your loan amount, so that's a big part of the difference there. But I would still expect that number to be a little bit closer to your real number in either of these scenarios. But again, if you missed the last section, closing costs they are costs you have to pay to get the loan, things like paying all the parties involved to get your loan, and the house, and then also any fees, like recording fees, title fees, whatever, in order to get the house. And then the other section is prepaid costs, which are costs you're just going to be paying on an ongoing basis. They're not new costs. They're not costs that you are, they're not fees or costs that you're paying to get the loan. They're costs that you will be paying on an ongoing basis as part of your loan, but in order to get you set up ahead of time, they have to take those as closing costs, which are called prepaids. So that means your total cash to close, all the cash you're going to have to bring to this scenario with your down payment and any other closing costs, is $436,430. All right, so then real quick in terms of qualifying, could you qualify for this loan? Could you qualify for this loan? How much income would you have to be making? Let's talk through those things real quick. And let me say at the beginning, I'm not talking about budgeting. I'm not talking about affordability. I'm not talking about how much you should decide personally how much income you need to be making in order to take on these monthly payments. I'm talking about whether the lender will give you the loan. Are you making enough income for the lender to say, yes, you can take on this loan? The way that the lender answers that question is they look at your DTI, which is your debt to income ratio. And your debt to income ratio is your total monthly debts over your gross monthly income. So total monthly debts over your gross monthly income. And this number is your new housing payment that you're proposing taking on in either scenario. They take that and they add it to any other monthly debts you have, your credit card, student loan, car debt, whatever. Add that all together and then divide it by your gross monthly income. And this number needs to be less than 50%. Now that 50% number is true. It is 100% true for conventional. It's pretty close. The the equation is the same for FHA if you're getting an FHA loan. And the number is slightly different, and I'm not going to get into that because it's very close, it's very similar, but the number is slightly different. Basically, if this number, total monthly debts, if other debts take you over 50%, if you have some other debts going on that take you over 50%, you might be able to get a little bit of wiggle room with FHA. But if it's just the housing payment by itself over your gross monthly income, with FHA, that number is slightly lower. It's closer to 47%. So that's with FHA. And then with VA, how they figure out whether you qualify, which this is not VA, that's an entirely different scenario. But if you're curious, it's a different process. They don't even use this equation. So what that means is, with this rule, if your total monthly debts divided by your gross monthly income need to be less than 50%, and then you're going to have to be making, for this scenario, you're going to have to be making $7,068 per month, and that's assuming you have no other debts. And then for this scenario over here, let's see if I can get this one right. 10,000 plus 1,800 is 11,800. 11,908. Let's see if I got that right. Yes, okay. 11,908 per month. So obviously in this scenario, it's going to be a pretty unique situation where you're making a decent, where you're making really good income, and you're a first-time home buyer. Usually first-time home buyers are coming with this lower, you maybe got a great new job, or you just haven't been saving a ton lately, but you're ready to buy. Whatever the situation is. Typically, you're probably going to have a larger down payment if you are making this kind of income. But just throwing this scenario out there for anyone to look at if they are in that kind of situation. One last note on this income. Because this number right here, gross monthly income, is, if you're just doing the calculations on your own, that number is pretty strictly calculated by the lender. So if you are paid in salary, then it's pretty straightforward. Usually your entire salary is usable. It's pretty easy to calculate, typically. However, if you are self-employed, or you make you make commission, or you are paid with variable hours, you work variable hours, if any of those things apply, then there's pretty strict rules in terms of how the lender calculates what your income is, what income they're going to use for their calculations. So you can look into those rules a little bit. Typically, it's just easiest to talk to a loan officer if you're in that situation, to give them a little bit of background about your income, get them a look at maybe your tax forms or your pay stubs, so they can get a sense of what income is going to be usable, what the lender will use. But that, whatever the number they end up calculating, however they get to that number, this situation would have to be $7,068 to qualify for that loan, and this situation would have to be $11,908 to qualify for that loan. All right, if you want to get a look at your own a quote on a house that you're looking at, or if you want to talk about how much income you would qualify for, how much of a loan you would qualify for, what price point you could buy. If you're interested in talking about any of that, please feel free to reach out to us. Again, I work with Cleveland Street Mortgage, based in Bothell, Washington. If you're ready to reach out and just get that conversation going, all our contact information is in the description below. If you are just more curious about our process, what it's like to work with us, and whether it would be a good fit to work with us, there's a video linked in the description that you can watch and get a sense of what our process is like. We work in Washington and Idaho. We do loans in Washington and Idaho. So feel free to reach out, and we'd be happy to get going with you.